Here's what's coming up in episode 220, Tim Prasil.
I went back a little bit further and I just wanted to see what was leading up to the Victorian period. And that's really when I started to find these very interesting stories about people who were going on ghost hunts that feel very much like ghost hunts today. I was sort of rethinking my own assumptions about the history of ghost hunting, which is that it starts in the mid to late 1800s. Maybe they're a member of an investigation team and they see that tradition goes back to the 1500s and they say, that's cool. I am part of this very long legacy.
Welcome to the Big Seance podcast. I'm Patrick Keller of BigSeance.com, and this is a place for an open discussion on all things paranormal, but specifically topics like ghosts and hauntings, paranormal research, spirit communication, psychics and mediums, and life after death. So basically, anything that pops up in my paranormal world. The candles are already lit, so you might as well come on in and join the seance.
Y'all, I am talking to a familiar voice today for many of you. And if he's not familiar to you, you're going to want to go back and get familiar with Tim Prasil. For a few years, from episodes 47 to 95 of the Big Seance, Tim gave us his Spectral Edition segments, which were very popular. And I still hear people say, what happened to Tim Prasil? And what happened to those Spectral Edition stories that would be included in the episodes? So if you're curious about that, you definitely need to check out those episodes. Again, they're from 47 to 95. And actually, Tim returned in episode 198 for a few episodes about a year ago. He did some railroad ghost stories for us. Tim writes ghostly mysteries. He anthologizes quirky, mostly 19th century fiction and explores historical ghost lore. He's also been known to scribble a limerick. Once upon a time, he had a career in radio broadcasting that took him from announcing to copywriting, and from Illinois to Mississippi, back to Illinois to Wisconsin, and finally to South Carolina. He then moved to Boston and earned an M.A. in English, taught in upstate New York, and moved to Milwaukee to earn a Ph.D. in English. After 30 years of teaching at the university level in Wisconsin and Oklahoma, he's now focusing on his books. Well, one of Tim's books, which really is fascinating, is called Help for the Haunted, a decade of Vera Van Slyke mysteries from 1899 to 1909. We interviewed Tim about that book way back in episode 22. He's also the author of titles such as The Victorian Ghost Hunter's Casebook, Entranced by Eyes of Evil, Tales of Mesmerism and Mystery, The Lost Limericks of Edgar Allan Poe, and several other books. And now we have a new title, Certain Nocturnal Disturbances, Ghost Hunting Before the Victorians. And we're going to talk about that book right now. Let's pour the tea. One thing we tend to focus on a lot is the fascinating Victorian time period and spiritualism. And so this is a look at everything before the Victorians. But, this ghost hunting in early history is not a new topic for you.
Well, in a way, it was new to me. Let me tell you about what led up to this book. And it actually started with Spectral Edition. Spectral Edition, the project was, I stumbled upon, I think it's up to about 300 or 400 now, but it's articles published in American newspapers between the years of 1865 to 1917. That's the end of the Civil War and the start of World War I, or U.S. involvement in World War I. I started coming across all these newspaper ghost reports, perfectly legitimate news articles talking about, we have heard that there's a haunted house, down the street. And I just became fascinated by these and started collecting them. And so to answer your earlier point of what happened to Tim Prasil, why doesn't he do Spectral Edition anymore? I wrote a book. I finally had enough where I said, I have to do something with all these articles. I'll put together a book. And that's what happened. But I think that in the process of doing that, the 1800s became fixed in my mind that this is an important era for the history of ghosts. And it is. It's a very important period, a century for the history of ghosts. That led to my next ghostlore book, historical ghostlore book, as I call it, called the Victorian Ghost Hunters Casebook. That is a collection of chronicles written by people, mostly British people, during the Victorian period. Let me toss this out too. The Victorian period is from 1837 to 1901. So the mid to late 1800s, roughly. I didn't really write that book. I assembled the Victorian Ghost Hunters Casebook because it's other writers who went on ghost hunts or ghost hunters who wrote about their experiences. And I assembled this together in a book that, again, fixed in my mind that it's the Victorian period where ghost hunting and particularly scientific approaches to dealing with ghosts and trying to understand ghosts, that's when it really develops. However, in writing the introduction to the Victorian Ghost Hunters Casebook, I went back a little bit further. And I just wanted to see what was leading up to the Victorian period. And that's really when I started to find these very interesting stories about people who were going on ghost hunts that feel very much like ghost hunts today. And actually, you know more about that than I do. So feel free to jump in here and correct me on how ghost hunting is done in the early 2000s. If you have the Victorian Ghost Hunters Casebook, you will read a few paragraphs that are the Reader's Digest, the mini version of Certain Nocturnal Disturbances. Because as I was looking at those pre-Victorian cases of ghost hunting, I was sort of rethinking my own assumptions about the history of ghost hunting, which is that it starts in the mid to late 1800s. That's an idea that I saw in other books on history of ghosts, and I saw it on the internet. So I think it's a fairly widespread notion that if you really want to look at the history of ghost hunting, you start in the mid to late 1800s, the Victorian period. But as I say, as I was writing the introduction to that book, I started finding more and more stories that come before that. So I said to myself, somebody really needs to write a book about this pre-Victorian ghost hunting history because it's significant and it's really interesting. And some of the most interesting parts of it are in how it never went away. Some of the ideas that came up, for instance, paranormal investigation teams. That goes back to the 1500s, which just sort of threw me at first. Really?
Yeah.
1500s? The idea of carefully weighing evidence, being a little bit cautious about hearing from a witness who claims to have seen a ghost and saying, okay, did you? I hope you did, but I'm not 100% certain that you did. Dealing with skepticism, that has roots that goes back. That goes back before the first century BC, or BCE, as we sometimes call it. Oh, the term ghost hunter. I've seen in books the claim that the term ghost hunter starts in the 1900s. Well, I looked into it. It goes back at least to the late 1700s. And I've been tracing it and finding a fair number of cases where the term ghost hunter is used either in the late 1700s or the very early 1800s. So that has a long, fascinating history to it. And I'm sure, I don't think anybody's ever going to find the first use of the term ghost hunter, because it was probably in spoken language rather than written language. And there's so much of that old stuff that's just been lost. It's crumbled into dust, or it's never been digitalized. So doing a word search is next to impossible. But I found a fair number of uses of the term ghost hunter before the Victorians. So the term, the themes, the challenges of ghost hunting all seem to come before the Victorians. And that's what was my focus in writing Certain Nocturnal Disturbances.
I really found it interesting how you molded, I forget how you described it, not necessarily like hearsay, but a lot of these stories don't come straight from the horse's mouth. Back then, they're like passed on over decades or generations, and then you find different resources and you kind of rewrite the story.
Right. I divided the book into two parts. The first part is legendary ghost hunts. And that's exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
The oral tradition, the stories that were passed not on writing, not on paper or papyrus, but just by word of mouth. In fact, the very first story, every ghost hunter should know the story of Athenodorus. We don't know exactly who the real life person is. There are at least two candidates for a person named Athenodorus, but there seems to have been actually a person named Athenodorus who lived in the 1st century BC, BCE, if you prefer. And 100 years later, a Greek philosopher named Pliny the Younger wrote down this story. He was writing to his mentor saying, "What do you think about this story?" And it's a really fascinating story, particularly if you're into ghost hunting today. You're going to go, "Oh my God, we still do that." It's what I call nocturnal surveillance, which is one of the main threads in ghost hunting throughout history. Wait until dark and then go to work, which is funny. And here's something that you might respond to. As I understand it, current ghost hunting thinking is that ghosts are energy, and you can use these devices to pick up the energy. Why then is ghost hunting still done at night? I mean, it seems like if it's energy, it's going to not follow night and day.
I hear different excuses for that.
Okay.
Many times it has to do with the gadgetry because, at night when people are sleeping, there's less electricity going, there's less noise going.
That makes sense.
But I mean, that's one thing I hear. And then sometimes I hear just, and this is the one that cracks me up. Seriously, they'll say, "Well, you can see shadows more." And I'm like, when it's dark, I don't see shadows more. I'm more likely to see a shadow when it's light. Yeah. Not that I jump out and do a lot of paranormal investigation anymore, but I don't necessarily aim for night. That's kind of a tradition.
Oh, okay.
And it's fun.
Right.
Fun and cool to be in the dark with equipment, but I don't think it's necessary at all.
Well, let me go back to Athenodorus, because he practiced nocturnal surveillance, and that's based on the idea that ghosts come out at night. He heard of this house in Athens, and it was going for a very cheap price, and he wondered why. So he asked around, and people said, "Oh, it's haunted. There's a scary, spooky guy with chains, and he looks horrible. He's got this raggedy beard. And he just follows you around, and it's creepy. So nobody wanted to live there. So you could get the place at a really good rent." And so he said, "I'll take it." And he wanted deliberately to investigate what this thing was. So he set up shop in this rented haunted house, started working on his writing, which I think is a really interesting part of the story. He didn't want to sit there waiting for a ghost, because that would push him toward seeing a ghost. If his expectations are high, you're more likely to see what you're expecting to see. So he wanted to push against that. So he just started working on his writing, presumably having nothing to do with ghosts. And in walks the ghost and starts clanking the chains. And Athenodorus, this is the best part of the story, I think, says, "Give me a sec. I'm doing a little writing here." then I'll get back to you. Horrible looking ghost. And so he finishes his sentence or something. Then he turns around and he sees this ghost that has been scaring people away. And the ghost makes this motion, which is he and Athenodorus interprets to be, follow me. And Athenodorus is a cool-headed guy. He's courageous. He's level-headed. He gets up and follows this ghost into the backyard where the ghost sinks down into the ground. And Athenodorus marks that spot. The next day, he goes to the magistrate and says, there's something up with this spot. We need to dig here. And he digs and he finds a shackled skeleton that's been there for years and years. So presumably the ghost while living was murdered, thrown in chains, buried unceremoniously. Athenodorus makes sure that these bones are dug up and given a proper burial, and the house is good. The house is no longer haunted. And it's a fascinating story. It's a story that gets repeated and repeated and repeated. You know, the details are different, but in one form or another, the story of Athenodorus just seemed to have a very strong appeal to people because it lasted through history. In terms of the history of ghost hunting, Athenodorus is this level-headed person. He investigates. He finds out the truth. The ghost isn't a scary monster. The ghost is actually a victim. And so he's helping the ghost rather than running away from the ghost. It's a fascinating story, but that story had circulated orally for about 100 years before Pliny the Younger wrote it down to his mentor saying, what do you think of this? Because I'm inclined to think it's a real thing, but I know that it's not 100% certain.
Do you think that the chains from that story, did that lead us to the tradition of, you know, for centuries, the chains with ghosts and like the ghost of Christmas past,
right,
you know,
right, yeah. Jacob Marley.
Yeah, jingling chains.
Right.
Do you think that has any connection or no?
Yes, I do. I think you can trace it back. It may not be the only influence on it, but I think it was one of the strong influences on it. That general story, maybe not even associated with the character of Athenodorus, but that it set a trend. And people followed that trend for centuries and centuries.
It's just so funny. Like, even when I was a kid, you know, you get your sounds of the haunted mansion.
Yes. And
and there's always chains. And
yep.
it's gone a long time, you know?
I had that album. Yep.
Yep.
Yeah, it is funny. And that's one of the things that I found most intriguing about writing this book is that, wow, we still have that.
Yeah.
We still have ghosts with chains. We still have nocturnal surveillance. We still struggle with the debate about ghosts. So much of what we experience has very deep roots, far back, much, much longer than 100 years or 150 years. It goes way, way back. And I found something very, very intriguing about that, very sort of enriching about that. And I'm hoping that some of my readers are ghost hunters and maybe they're a member of an investigation team and they see that tradition goes back to the 1500s and they say, that's cool. I am part of this very long legacy. It's different. It has evolved over time, but I still have this connection with ghost hunters in the 1500s. I'm hoping people discover that and go, that's cool.
Yeah.
I'm now more proud of what I do because of the rich history behind it.
Yeah.
So that's one of the legendary ghost hunters. And there are three others. There is a poet, a real poet. I have to take a quick look at her name. There is a poet from much later, from the 1600s. Her full name is Antoinette Deshoulieres de la Garde de los Chers.
Very nice.
I'm sure I mangled that. I don't know that I got that even close to correct, but yeah, it's a great name. But she was real. And she was what's called a materialist. She thought that things that other people said, oh, this is all rooted in the supernatural, she would say, no, it's not. In other words, she was a big believer that just about anything could be explained physically. You don't have to turn to the supernatural for an explanation. You only have to turn to nature to understand things. About 200 years later, she became a character in a story that was presented as if it truly happened. As far as I know, there's no evidence from the 1600s that this ever really happened. It's just stories started to circulate. And by the early 1800s, people started writing them down. And that's how you and I know about them now. So there's not much hard evidence that this ever really happened. But she has an interesting adventure. It's all legend, but she was a guest at a castle and she heard that this castle had a haunted room. And she got very excited. And her host and hostess said, well, it's, everybody's terrified of this room, so you don't want to go in there. And she said, I want to go in there. In fact, I want to sleep there. Put me there tonight. And they went, no, what are you talking about? There's this horrible, horrible ghost. And it's very similar to the Athenodorus story. But she insisted, and her host and hostess said, oh, okay, fine. We'll put you in there. It's, we're not accepting responsibility. If you get terrified or never come out of that room again alive, that's up to you. And sure enough, she goes in there. Things are going pretty well, but then she starts hearing noises. And clearly there's something walking around her room, and it's bumping into things, which is not typical behavior for a ghost. But she's thinking, okay, I got to figure this out. She finally hears the footsteps. They come close enough to her bed that she reaches out and grabs this thing, and it's furry and it's big, and it starts licking her hand. And she just holds on to it. The room is completely dark. She holds on to it till morning, and she finds out it's the dog. It's just
imagine that.
It came into the room. It's the lock on the door is pretty faulty. So she debunked the ghost and said, no, it's not a horrible monster. It's an adorable pooch who loves being held all night long. And the dog was very happy to have her hang on to it all night long because it kept her warm, or it kept the dog warm.
And a dog who apparently has really bad eyesight or is
yes.
not familiar with the layout of the room.
Yeah. I get the sense that it's a big dog too. So big dogs tend to bump into things. So a similar story to the Athenodorus story, but completely legend. There's no reason to believe that this ever really happened. They're teaching us lessons, how to be a good ghost hunter, how to not accept things on face value, particularly in terms of ghosts. Think twice about ghosts, be level-headed, and you might find that the truth is not as scary as you think. Both of those stories have parallels. There are a couple of other ghost hunters who were Cornish pastors in the 1600s or thereabouts, who same sort of deal. They dealt with ghosts. They got rid of ghosts in one way or another. In one case, it's a very, very frightening ghost. In the other, it's, again, nothing to be afraid of. It's a spirit in trouble, a spirit seeking help. But these stories were not written down for hundreds of years. So I group those in the legendary ghost hunters. The bigger part of the book is called historic ghost hunters. And there we do have substantial, good historical evidence. I don't know how reliable it is because sometimes these ghost hunters clearly had an agenda. Mm-hmm. They weren't out to disprove ghosts, but quite the opposite. They were working toward affirming the idea that the supernatural realm does mix with the natural realm, that ghosts do come to visit the living, that God intervenes, that there is such a thing as divine intervention, because that was an idea that was being challenged, particularly in the 1700s. And so these ghost hunters were telling their stories to foster belief. So that might have been their bias. Maybe they're not entirely reliable, but they are the ones who recorded their adventures. And They also follow nocturnal surveillance, but they start to develop new investigative techniques such as witness interrogation. That's maybe too rough a word. Witness interviews. And a man named Joseph Glanvill, one of the most famous figures in the history of ghost hunting, he dealt with a case called the Drummer of Tedworth, which is a fairly famous case. But he was very careful about weighing the evidence and double checking his sources in most cases. At times, he became very lax. He was actually as much a witch hunter as a ghost hunter. And that's one of the things I touch on is the sort of uncomfortable mingling of ghost hunting with witch hunting. But his goal was to show that there are such things as witches, there are such things as ghosts. Yet, at the same time, he was very concerned with how much should I trust this witness telling me that he or she has a ghost, which is something I think that ghost hunters probably still grapple with. I'm hearing stories about this place being haunted. How much should I trust that? Again, I'm going to turn to your expertise on modern day ghost hunting. Is there much interviewing witnesses these days?
I think we continue to have the biases. Like you either have people who are into the paranormal because, how dare someone claim to have a ghost when they're just, doing fakery or.
Yeah. So they're out to debunk the haunting. Yeah.
Yes. They're the debunkers and it's like accusations or whatever. And then you have the people that are just curious and they want to prove that it's a thing and they can't wait to find proof. And so I think it just depends on what side of that you come from. I don't think we've yet found in general, and for sure on TV. Mm-hmm. I don't think we've found a nice middle, but I would think that interviewing witnesses is a super important thing. You have to narrow it, figure out who wasn't there,
right?
Who was there, narrow those things down to understand it, because most ghost hunters will spend hours and hours and hours and hours in a location and not experience what supposedly goes on there. So
right.
The witness becomes very important.
Exactly. Yeah. And investigating the site, I'm sure, are there other explanations? They hear this weird humming. Could it be the pipes or an owl in the attic or something like that? But yeah, I definitely deal with that in Certain Nocturnal Disturbances. Some ghost hunters lean toward being debunkers. Others lean toward being believers. But one of the points that I make is that belief in ghost isn't all or nothing. It's a sliding scale. And ghost hunters would presumably be somewhere in the middle. They would lean one way or the other, but they're not taking an extreme position, because then why bother to investigate at all? If you know that ghosts exist, there's no call to go about doing an investigation. Or the opposite. If, like Antoinette, if you are highly skeptical, then why bother going into that room? But she did go into that room. She wanted to find out if it was a ghost or not. Turned out it wasn't. So that's one of the things that I discuss. And that's one of the things that you really see with these pre-Victorian ghost hunters, is that they struggle with skepticism and belief. None of them take an extreme position. They're somewhere in the middle.
Well, speaking of belief, you use this question to introduce one of your sections. You say, one thing I've learned about history is that it's often a mistake to ask, what did people believe back then?
Right.
And that the better question is, what did people disagree about back then? What did you mean by that?
Well, there are people today, I've heard them, and I've got one example. If you give me a moment, hopefully I can find it very quickly. Let me read you something from my introduction. And I've met people who are like this, who look at the past and think, oh, people were dumb back then. before I was born, people were stupid. They take this very sort of arrogant attitude toward history, thinking that people must have all believed in ghosts. And I have an example of exactly that. It appeared in 1863, a man named George Cruikshank, I want to say. He described people of a century and a half earlier this way. The gullibility of the public was much greater at that time than now, and they would swallow anything in the shape of a ghost. Now, he's talking about people from Glanvill's period, but Glanvill was very careful. He knew that he had a lot of skeptics in his audience, and that's why he was working so hard to make sure that his evidence was good, solid evidence.
So after thinking about that, 200 plus years from now, what will people say about our ways of ghost hunting and researching the paranormal?
Hopefully they will say it was fascinating and not entirely unlike what we still do today. I wonder if we're ever going to settle this debate. As I say, you can trace it back to the 1st century BC. It's an old debate. And I think that relates back to the question of what did I mean by don't make the mistake of looking back in history and thinking that everybody agreed on any topic. They were human beings just like you and I, just like human beings will be 200 years from now. They won't agree on anything. It's sort of in our nature to be contentious, might be the right word, combative. But boy, we sure like to disagree on things, and we sure like to debate things. And ghosts is the perfect example of that, for, at least 2,000 years, people have been debating, are ghosts real or not?
Right.
That's what I'm talking about, is people before the Victorians, they also debated ghosts. Depending on who you talk to, you would meet people who said, yeah, I had an experience that, convinces me that ghosts are probably an authentic thing. But then somebody overhearing that would say, oh, no, they're not. Don't be ridiculous. It's just your mind playing tricks on you, or you're a liar or something like that.
What's a purposeless ghost?
A purposeless ghost is an idea that came up in the Victorian period, or at least it solidified in the Victorian period. Late 1800s, the Society for Psychical Research, I believe her first name was Irene, I want to say, but her last name was definitely Sedgwick. She did a study of the data that the Society for Psychical Research had gathered on haunted houses. She narrowed down these hundreds of reports to, I think, about 25. And she said, okay, what can I learn from these 25 chronicles of encounters with ghosts? And she came up with, I believe it was 8 conclusions. The first one was, it doesn't have to happen in an old house. New houses can be haunted. The fourth one was, ghosts don't seem to come for any clear purpose. Now, this kind of flies in the face of centuries of ghosts returning to say, I have been murdered. Think of Athenodorus again. The ghost was saying, I've been mistreated. I've been poorly buried. Please dig me up.
Coming back for revenge.
Yeah, coming back for revenge, or just to right a wrong. Sometimes it's a hidden will, and I want to make sure that my ancestors get their due. So a ghost comes back. There's a long tradition in the Catholic Church of spirits from purgatory coming back to solicit prayers so that they can move on from purgatory. That would be a purposeful ghost, one who clearly has a mission. And it's the ghost hunter's job to figure out what that mission is. Late 1800s, there's this new idea of, well, we've looked at ghosts scientifically, but there are very few that, if any, that have a purpose. So these became the new 19th century purposeless ghost. And a few ghostologists started to write about this thing. What I do in my book is I look at a pre-Victorian case. It's the case of Hinton Ampner haunting. And I approach it as this sure looks like a purposeless ghost. It was a very frustrating case for the people who investigated it because it didn't fit in with any of the traditional purposeful ghost kind of stories. There was a hint that maybe the ghost had left behind a will under some floorboards. They pulled up the floorboards, and clearly somebody had once upon a time put something in there, but now there was nothing in there. So that didn't seem to be the case. It's just the manifestations and the evidence of the haunting just never gelled. Nothing fit. It just felt like a lot of chaotic, ghostly activity. So possibly a poltergeist.
That, or it almost sounds to me like it, we talk about today, most people would use the term residual ghost.
Right.
That's just acting out its thing every day. It's just kind of energy on repeat.
Yeah. And yet even that didn't make sense because the manifestations didn't fit with the known history of the house. So nothing really came together. And the main ghost hunter in that case never wanted to talk about it afterwards. It was three sources said, I met this guy and I asked him about his investigation of Hinton Ampner. And he just got very angry and walked away. He was not want to talk
from paranormal investigation.
Exactly. And I think his drama came from not being able to figure it out. There was no purpose to this ghost. And let's see, that's the late 1700s. In an era when ghosts had a purpose, I think he confronted maybe one of the earliest purposeless ghosts or one of the earliest purposeless ghosts on record, because the going thinking is, and it's not that ghosts had a Zoom meeting one day in the early 1800s and say, hey guys, let's give up being purposeful. The thinking is they existed prior to the 1800s. It's just the stories were so baffling that nobody wrote them down. The writers, people like Glanvill, who wanted to prove that ghosts are real, they wouldn't do anything with that. They were much more attracted to this ghost had a purpose. We figured out what the purpose was, and then the ghost went away. That's a nice, tidy story. Hinton Ampner is not a nice, tidy story. It's a confusing story. And like I say, the chief ghost hunter just became frustrated and never wanted to talk about it again.
I have just general questions, knowing the kind of nerd that you are, getting to know you over the years and your voice.
Yeah. Go for it.
Do you have any superstitions? Are you picking your feet up when you go over railroad tracks?
Oh,
are you, do you have any? Do you avoid black cats, like things like that?
Black cats came immediately to mind because, yes, if I do see one cross my path, I pause for a moment and say, okay, can I easily take an alternative route? I don't know about these. What was the railroad tracks one? I never heard of that one.
I often hear about people going over railroad tracks and they either I think some people hold their breath while they go over. Some people pick up their feet in the car.
Yeah. Seems like you might stop on the tracks, which probably not a good idea.
Especially if you're the driver. You probably want to have some connection with the gear or something.
Yeah. The accelerator. Slow down when you cross railroad tracks. That's not a good idea. The cat I can deal with, but
I think that, holding your breath, I think that is, I'm confusing that with people holding their breath when they drive by a cemetery.
Oh, I haven't heard of that one either. No.
I think that's what I'm thinking of with the holding your breath thing.
Is the notion that your breath will be stolen? Or
I don't know, but it also seems like if it's a pretty big cemetery you're driving by, you could end up in the cemetery if you hold your breath long enough.
Right. And especially if there's a train track across the way.
Right. Oh my gosh, you're totally screwed.
Hold your breath and lift your feet.
Totally screwed if that happens. And then I'd also just like to know, what time in history would you most like to go back to?
Oh.
And what would your life look like? What would you be? I mean, I kind of picture you still being like a author, writer, the same person, just sitting in a different time period? What do you think?
Right. Well, my first feeling is late 1800s, early 1900s seems to be the period that I know best and I feel comfortable there. My Vera Van Slyke stories are set during that period, and I just feel like I know it very well. What would I be doing then? Certainly there were authors back then putting together books, which is what I do. So
would you be ghost hunting?
I'm not sure, to tell you the truth, because I'm fascinated by ghost hunting, but I don't do it. I'm much more interested in the history of it. I have had some ghostly experiences, which I can share with you if you'd like.
Absolutely. We don't need an excuse to talk about that
ghost
here.
Stories. Yeah. Let's talk what has happened to us. And then maybe you can tell me some of yours. But yeah, I do community theater. And we work in a building that has had numerous ghost hunters go out there and to investigate it because strange things happen. People hear their names whispered. My wife has had that experience. Finally, after years and years of being out there, I had that experience myself. And it's just, wow. Thank goodness. It took me forever to have my name whispered. We have a sound and light booth that is upstairs, and the stairs leading up to the booth are creepy. I was running sound for one play, and I saw somebody out of the corner of my eye coming up those stairs, and I waited till they got to the top, and then I turned to look at them, and there was nobody there. So a lot of corner of the eye things. We have a costume room that has all kinds of donations. All of our costumes, I think, are authentic clothes from, boy, you name it. It probably goes back to the 1800s.
Yeah.
But mostly from the 1830s, 1840s, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. See, I do live in the 1800s. But that place is creepy. It's definitely a hot spot. There was a little rambunctious puppy once who had just run everywhere around the theater until it got to the costume room, and it just refused to go inside there. It knew something was going on in there. So I've had experiences, but I've never done the nocturnal surveillance thing. I don't know why.
A theater is a fun place to do that.
Yeah. What is it about theaters that, I don't think I've ever stepped inside a theater that hasn't had a ghost story to go along with it. So I'm going to say no, I would not have been a ghost hunter simply because I'm not one now. But I would have been fascinated to hear the stories of other ghost hunters, which is quirky, isn't it? I don't know why that is.
Well, I mean, it's also, I don't know. I guess it's kind of also why I do what I do, but I don't necessarily jump out there anymore to get involved in it. For one, because it's tiring and time consuming, but I do love to think about it and to ask the questions and be curious about it, and then let somebody else do the work.
Exactly. Actually, if you and I lived in the late 1800s, we might be more invested in ghost hunting because it was very leisurely. It was nice. You find a place, you get a bottle of bourbon, a good book, maybe bring your dog, and you just sit there. There's not walking. You let the ghost come to you rather than you go to the ghost. There's not a lot of electronic devices going on. You're just sitting there, and you and I would just maybe have a cognac and discuss our day and hope that a ghost comes up. It seems actually very appealing.
And then pass the story along.
Exactly. Or write it down. And one day, some guy named Tim Prasil will put it in a book. So ghost hunting, I'm rethinking my answer. Maybe I would be a ghost hunter.
It was the alcohol that got you excited wasn't it?
That's 80% of it, yeah. But there is something very appealing to Victorian style ghost hunting. It's very elegant. And as you say, alcohol. There's alcohol involved. So why not?
Well, last big question, and then I just want to give you the opportunity to give any final thoughts about the book or any final thoughts on anything. But since I've talked to you last, one of my favorite questions that I like to ask most of my guests is, what is your most treasured possession?
Oh, dear. That's a big question. I'm a guy who doesn't really treasure possessions very much. I'm scanning my office right now, trying to think of it. Okay, I'm going to regret this answer, perhaps, but maybe not. Once upon a time, I bought an antique humidor. Do you know what a humidor is?
I don't think I do.
It's basically the size of an end table, or at least this one is. And there's a cabinet in there. You pull the door open and it's covered in copper. You put your cigars in there and it prevents the humidity or encourages the humidity. I'm not entirely sure. I think it holds out the humidity so that your cigars are good. And this thing has to be from probably the 1920s. There is a small library shelf. It's a tilted, I can't really describe it very well, but it's a tilted shelf for books below it. And so I have a number of antique books. They go there. I call it my haunted humidor. It's got a doily on top and a candle.
Yes.
A little Edgar Allan Poe figurine. So I'm going to go with that.
Okay. That is very interesting. That's a good answer.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I can't say I'm 100% confident of that answer, but as far as answers go, I'm going to stick with it.
It's what came to mind, and that was our first humidor.
There you go. And hopefully it's haunted. My fingers are crossed. I've actually haven't had any experiences along those lines, but I'm assuming it's haunted.
I'm staring right now at this antique. I forget if they called it a chest or I don't know. What do they sometimes call these things? But it is enormous. It is from the late 1800s and it's got like embossed some kind of metal. And it's also got wood around it, like shaped. I'm totally doing a horrible job explaining this, but I cleaned it up and I don't even have anything in it. Like I've got stuff sitting on top of it, but I have been hoping that this thing, it's from the 1800s. I've been hoping it's haunted, and so far I haven't gotten any experiences.
Is it a wardrobe? Could you walk through it and
it's
enter a different dimension?
Chest is not the word. Why am I using the word chest? Like a
trunk?
Trunk.
There you go.
It. It is a trunk.
Okay. Oh yeah, that's probably haunted.
Yeah, it's beautiful. The inside is really rough. It's lined with newspapers from like God knows when. I don't even remember.
Yeah, that sounds great.
But nothing yet. We'll see. Hey, do you have any final thoughts about the book or anything?
In the middle of October on YouTube and elsewhere, I'm starting a series. It's actually the second season of this series in which I read stories, mostly ghost stories, but otherwise edge of your seat kind of stories. I start them shortly before Halloween, and I do 10 stories, post one a week leading up to Christmas. And I'm trying to re-spark the old tradition of sharing ghost stories around a fire at Christmas time. Or I just wrote a blog post about how in America, sharing ghost stories by the fire did exist, but it wasn't necessarily connected to Christmas the way that it was in England. It was just a cold night. And I've got one piece of evidence that said this was on Halloween. We shared this fireside ghost story. And another one that says this was on New Year's Eve and we shared this fireside ghost story. So I'm trying to re-spark that really interesting tradition, which I suppose is most associated with Victorian England. But as I say, it happened in the US too. I'm sure it happened in other countries, probably around the world, sharing stories around some kind of fire, whether it's a campfire And sharing specifically spooky stories by a fire just seems like it's such a neat thing. And I don't know that we do it that much anymore. Mm-hmm. There's sort of a movement. I'm certainly not alone in trying to revive this old custom. And this is the digital version of it. If you go to the YouTube channel, well, let me give you the title of it. It's called Tales Told When the Windows Rattle. And I think if you just Google that title, you'll find the podcast version of it. You'll find the YouTube version of it. The YouTube videos, I alternate between looking out the window at bad snow and rain and wind and a cozy fire inside. So it's just a chance to sit down and listen to a fictional story. Although I'll be honest with you, a couple of the stories in this season are actual, purportedly true ghost stories of Victorian ghost hunters and their chronicles. At the end of them, I do a promotion for my books. If you want to skip over that, it's very easy. When you come to the end of the story, you can just go to the next one. I do hope you stick around and listen to my spiel for buy my books. But I understand if you don't, it's always at the end though. So I would ask your listeners to look out for that. If you're into ghost stories that aren't necessarily true, but they're certainly spooky and creepy, and you just want to sit down sometime, listen to Tales Told When the Windows Rattle. And if you miss my voice from the old Spectral Edition featurettes, you'll hear a lot of my voice, probably more than you want to hear.
Well, we will include links to all of those things that Tim just mentioned and Tales Told in the show notes, including a link to Tim's site, which I believe is still brombonesbooks.com, correct?
Correct.
And the book we've been talking about tonight is Certain Nocturnal Disturbances, Ghost Hunting Before the Victorians. And you can find those Spectral Edition segments. I'm telling you, if you have never heard Tim before, if this is your first time you're meeting Tim, then episodes 47 to 95, there are so many Spectral Editions to get caught up in. And you can just go to the show notes and look at the timestamp. I put a timestamp of when all of Tim's Spectral Editions are, and you will enjoy them.
Should we explain that they are, about 3 to 5 minute featurettes? It's me reading the old ghost reports that I found in newspapers. So actual ghost reports, not fiction.
Because you love digging up and researching old stories.
Yeah. And I just started finding all of these articles and I said, what is this? What is going on? I have to do something with these things. So I started recording them.
And you're the perfect voice to do that.
Oh, thank you.
We love it.
Are you saying I sound like a ghost?
Now we just need to start putting chains rattling in the background.
There you go. Oh, I wish I had a chain handy. My bike is over there.
I need to have just a prop in here all the time. Just be ready to shake it.
Well, we've got the tea kettle, right?
Yeah.
There you go.
And plenty of cups. I have coffee cups around here, and I have a candelabra around here. Sometimes I put up here on the desk.
Perfect. So, you need a chain. We have to get you a chain.
Tim Prasil, you rock. Thanks for coming back again.
Thank you. Happy to do it.
Thank you to the following super paranerds who support the show at patreon.com/Big Seance. Michael Henson, Daryl, Anne-Marie Sullivan, Natalie N., Kim Robb, Josiel Lorenzo, and Susan Davey. My supporters at the Parlor Guest level, who can be found at bigseance.com/parlorguests, are Allie of Hocus Pocus Collector, Miranda from SpookyLittleHalloween.com, Chelsea from Cheers with Chelsea, Linda from ShimmeringMoons.com, Anne Rekovich from OzParatech.com, Janae Michaels from Grey House Tarot and Farm Artifacts, Mitchell Coombs from MitchellCoombs.com, Dina DeCastro of Dina DeCastro Astrology, Amy Park Gedicke of amyparkg.com, Lonnie Scott from weirdwebradio.com, Lana and John of Carbon Lilies, Andrew Watson, Amy Taylor, Danielle Hembury, Alicia Ferguson, Morgan O'Hearn, Sarita Cockerham, Christine Rath Selhe, Mindy Kentop, Hope Battaglia, Cass and Bailey, Melissa Armour, Diane Rax, Bruce Williams, Christopher Kohler, Jim Budd, and David Rubenstein. That sound you just heard was the above and beyond. There's not even a category for your level of support fireworks display, because I have 7 awesome listeners who support this show at the $10 level. Peggy Hagan, Glenna Becker, Steve Skinner, Kevin Gilbert, James Wilfong, and Norman and Linda Keller. And I have a new Parlor guest who's supporting the show at the $15 level, Jean Marie. Oh my gosh, Jean, you rock. So thank you, Peggy, Glenna, Steve, Kevin, James, Mom and Dad, and Jean Marie. And thank you, Paranerds. For show notes, including links to anything we may have mentioned in this episode, visit bigseance.com. And you can continue the discussion and hang out with a great community of paranerds by joining us in the Big Seance Parlor on Facebook. Want to hear your voice in a future episode? Go to bigseance.com/feedback to learn how. Thank you so much for listening. Unfortunately, it's time to blow the candles out, but we'll see you and light them again next time. Peace out. Thanks for the selfie, too. I'm going to share it.
Sure. No problem.
Bye.
So long. How do I get out of this?
I'm going to end it right now, and then that's how you'll get out of it.
I'm stuck forever.
Bye.